Greetings everyone. In this video we're going to pick things up where we left off regarding the traditional square of opposition, forming kind of the core component of categorical logic. So last time I sort of walked you through how to find the contradictories and contraries for A and O propositions and E and I propositions, as well as the contrary of A and E. So I'm going to move forward with the square of opposition and introduce you to the next two types of immediate inference we can make, subcontrary and subalternation. So just to review a little bit, if you remember from last time, contradictories are propositions that both can't be true, right? So if we have an A proposition, which is our universal affirmative, and we have a true A proposition, its contradictory O proposition, that particular negative, cannot be true. So it has to be false. So that is an immediate inference we can make. And similarly, if we begin with a true O proposition, we know from immediate inference from the logic of contradiction that the corresponding A proposition has to be false. So that is known every single time. Those are totally determined. Similarly, if we begin with an E proposition, a true E proposition, that universal negative, no SRP, we know that its contradictory proposition, the I, has to be false. The particular affirmative has to be false. And similarly, if we begin with a true I proposition, we know that the E proposition has to be false. So they can't have the same value. And that's true for every contradiction. We then talked about contraries, which are very similar to contradictories. The contraries are at the top of the square. Contraries are our A, universal affirmative propositions, and our E, universal negative propositions. These are very close in value, but there is a slight difference. We know that if we begin with a true contrary, a true A proposition, for example, the E has to be false. However, if we begin with a false E, we do not know whether or not the corresponding contrary is true or false. So the contrary is said to be undetermined. We just don't have enough information on the basis of the relation to make that inference. So starting with a false contrary doesn't generate a true contrary, it just generates an undetermined contrary. We need more information to make the inference. So they are less determinate than contradictories. All right, so do bear that in mind when you're applying the square. Okay, so to move forward now, we have our our third set of immediate inferences, and this has to do with the logic of subcontraries. Subcontraries are very similar in logical structure to contraries, but they take place at the bottom of our square, which is our particulars, right? We have our particular negative with the I, particular negative, particular affirmative, some SRP, and then we have our O category, our particular negative, some S or not B. Please bear with my handwriting here, not the best today. Okay. Now, subcontraries, in terms of the immediate inferences we can make, are kind of the reverse of contraries. If we begin with a false I proposition, we can make the inference that the corresponding subcontrary, the O proposition, that particular negative, has to be true. That is an inference we can make. There's enough information that allows that immediate inference. However, if we begin with a false, if we begin with a true O proposition, we don't have enough information to make the inference about the corresponding subcontrary. So that value would be undetermined. We need more information. And this is true also if we begin with a true I proposition. The corresponding O proposition has to be undetermined. Okay, so we just don't know in that case. So there's the same amount of determination as there is with contraries, just the values are reversed. If we move from false to true, it's a valid inference. But if we move from true to false, that's an invalid inference. It has to be undetermined. So just to kind of break this down in terms of our book's technical definition, subcontraries are pairs of propositions that cannot both be false at the same time, but both can be true. If one is false, then the other must be true. So this kind of follows from what we had just worked on here. If we have a particular affirmative and I proposition, and the subcontrary would be the O, the particular negative. Let's take a proposition like this. Some coins are pennies. So just ask yourself, what category of proposition is this? This is a particular affirmative, right? This is an I proposition. And if we begin with a true I proposition, we can not make the inference about the value of the corresponding subcontrary. That is undetermined, right? Some coins are not pennies. And you can kind of just, if you think about the content there for a moment, this is true or false, right? So we don't have enough kind of closure really around the relationship of subcontrarity to make that immediate inference. If we begin with a proposition like this, however, some oranges are not citrus fruits. Again, ask yourself, what category of proposition is this? This is an O proposition, right? This is a particular negative. And if we're given a value of false, we know that this is a false claim. We can definitely make the inference that the subcontrary, the corresponding I proposition, is true. Some oranges are citrus fruits, and that is a true claim, right? The content is true. All right, so subcontraries move from falsity to truth with determinacy, but they do not move from a true value to a false value with determinacy. The inference is undetermined if we start with a true subcontrary, because the opposing subcontrary could either be true or false, depending on the circumstance. Okay? So a little more information here. When you begin with a true subcontrary, the inference to the O proposition is said to be undetermined. Remember that. Definitely get familiar with the similarity and difference between contraries and subcontraries in this regard, because the opposite is the case, right? When you begin with a subcontrary that is false, the inference to the opposite proposition is true. Okay, so it's the false proposition that generates a determinate immediate inference. All right. Now let's talk about subalternation. In a way, subalternation is the most interesting kind of immediate inference we can make on the square of opposition. It allows us to sort of play with a lot of arguments here. Subalternation refers to the relationship between a universal proposition, which is called the superaltern, and its corresponding particular proposition, which we call the subaltern. So with subalternation, we're moving from the top of the square, our A propositions and our E propositions, down to the bottom of the square, our particular propositions, where we have on the left our I propositions and our O propositions. All right? So let's kind of break down a little bit further how this works in terms of the logic. If we have A, universal affirmative, and I, particular affirmative propositions, these are subalterns. If the A claim is true, then the I claim is true. If the I claim is true, the A claim is undetermined. So a good way to think about this is that with respect to subalternation, if we're moving from a superaltern, a universal, to its corresponding particular, and we start with a true claim, we know that the corresponding subaltern is also true. So truth on the square of opposition always flows down. However, if we're beginning with a subaltern with that particular proposition, we can't make the inference to its corresponding superaltern the universal. We just don't know. There's not enough information to make the immediate inference. If an A claim is false, the I claim is said to be undetermined. If an I claim is false, the A claim is also false. Okay, so when we begin at the top of the square with a false claim, a false universal, we can't make the inference about the value with its corresponding particular. Okay, falsity does not flow down in the same way that a true value flows down. If, however, we begin with a false particular claim at the bottom of the square with an I claim, we know for sure that the corresponding universal claim, the A claim, is also false. That is an immediate inference we can make. So false values do determinately flow up on the square of opposition. So let's have a look at this in terms of some examples. If we start with a sentence like this, a proposition, all musical instruments are difficult things to master. Think about what type of, what category of proposition this is. This is a universal affirmative, right? This is an A proposition. And if we're given the value that it's true, try to think about, based on the law of subalternation, what the value of the corresponding subaltern would be. First of all, what category of proposition does the subaltern have to be on the square of opposition? If you've picked I, you're correct, right? I corresponds to A on the square of opposition, and if we're beginning with a true A claim, the I claim is also true because truth flows down. So if we transform the A claim into an I claim, we get some musical instruments are difficult things to master. This claim is also true, right? And this kind of just makes intuitive sense, I think, if you just stop for a moment and put away all of the architecture of the square. If we're really saying every instrument in the world is difficult to master, then surely it also follows that some or a few instruments are difficult things to master too, right? Because it's a smaller scope of things that is included within the universal. All right, so think of the A claim as capturing more entities in a way, and the particular is sort of contained or in the universal with respect to a true categorical proposition. When we're talking about the E claims, let's have a look at how this works. We begin on the right side of the square with the universal negative. And we move down from the E claim to the O claim, the particular negatives, right? The logic works just the same. If we begin with an E claim that is true, no musical instruments are difficult things to master, we move down the square to generate its corresponding particular, which is the particular negative, the O claim. The sentence becomes, some musical instruments are not difficult things to master. We know that that is true as well. That is an immediate inference that we can make because truth flows down on both sides of the square of opposition. Okay, and again, just based on the sort of the intuitive logic of the thing, if we're saying there is not a single instrument in the world that is difficult to master, then it must also be the case that some musical instruments are not difficult to master as well, right? It's a smaller claim in scale, in scope, right? If E is true, O is true. If O is true, E is undetermined. So notice we can't move from the O claim, if it's true, to a determination about the truth value of the E claim. The E claim remains undetermined. There's not enough information to make an immediate inference moving from the subaltern to the superaltern. So the value has to be undetermined in such instances. Truth does not flow up. It only flows down on the square. If an E claim is false, the O claim is undetermined. If an O claim is false, the E claim is false. So on the square of opposition, remember that falsity only flows up, right? If we're beginning with an E at the top of the square, we can't immediately move down to the O claim and know anything about its value. It is an undetermined value. However, if we begin with an O claim that is false, we know it's to be given as false, we can immediately infer that its corresponding E claim is false too. Falsity flows up always. So the particular, if false, becomes false as well. All right, so let's look at the square of opposition here. You have the full breakdown of oppositions. Contrariety